Tsuyu Asui is a fictional character in the Final Fantasy series. She was created by Yoshitaka Amano and first appeared in Final Fantasy VIII. She is an elf and was the companion of the protagonist, Prince Christopher. She has since become a popular and iconic character in the games. This article intends to provide a detailed look at her life. The story. The events in the games take place a few years after the events of Final Fantasy VIII, sometime between the end of the war with the Garwold Confederacy and the start of the Quiller invasion. The player takes control of Prince Christopher, the last of the House of Asani, the royal family of the Elves of Valinor. With the help of the Dwarf King, Duggan, and his dog, Pug, Christopher is positioned to become the new king of the elves. During these events, Tsuyu is caught up in a web of political intrigue and is faced with the possibility of marrying the vile wizard, King Solomon. Her first adventure begins when Prince Christopher, Pug, and the Dwarf King set out to rescue her from a kidnapping by the evil Brood, the former king of the dwarves. Tsuyu, like many of the other elf characters, possesses great magical power. She can summon uncontrollable whirlwinds by thinking hard and knows how to use this ability to great effect. She is also a capable fighter and a good leader. She is known to have a strong sense of responsibility and justice. Creation and design. Tsuyu was first introduced to the player in Final Fantasy VIII. She is seen briefly in the prologue of the game. Her elf body is fully modeled and textured, but her face is a combination of two others. The player has the option of having the elf look one way, the dwarf another, or a random one. In the Final Fantasy series, she is known for her hair, which is long and red. It was most likely a wig, but when she is excited or happy, her hair appears much fuller and more golden. When she is angry or upset, it appears much darker and more brown, but still quite long. In the games, she wears a brown dress, which covers her whole body. It is unlaced and unadorned. When she fights, she wears a leather armor, which covers her body completely. It is also unlaced and unadorned. Her boots and gloves are likewise leather and cover the entirety of her lower body. She always wears a necklace, which is a plain gold pendant, the Valinor Elf Star, as a symbol of elven royalty. She rarely appears without it. It's interesting to note that even in the games and artwork, her hair appears to be the only thing that is natural. Everything else, including her eyes, lips, and skin, appear to be the exact opposite. Her name, Tsuyu, is pronounced like the Japanese word for snow. In the West, it is sometimes romanized as Suro. Tsuyu Asui. Tsuyu is a Valinor elf name. It means snowflower. As a member of the elven race, she possesses an elven appearance. She was originally from Valinor, a small elven kingdom. She was chosen as the companion of Prince Christopher, aka the Boy King, because of her great magical power and her ability to summon and command the winds to her aid. She is known to be a capable fighter. She is also quite the adventurer. In the early games, it was she who challenged the demon lord, Belios, to a duel. She defeated him in single combat. She is also a very capable magic user. In Final Fantasy VIII, she is the one who summons the Quillers. In Final Fantasy IX, she is the one who uses her magic to create the Elfstones. It was also she who, during the events of Final Fantasy VIII, discovers that her elf companion, Prince Arutha, is in fact her older brother. They are very close in age. Tsuyu is known to have a strong sense of responsibility and justice. She is also protective of her elf kin. She will not hesitate to kill those who would harm them. She is also known to be an excellent leader, capable of inspiring those around her and calming the most excitable. The games also show that she has a great affection for Pug, aka White Pug, the friendly dwarf. Despite his race and differences, he has become like a brother to her. In the manga and anime adaptations, she has a more tragic past. She was the one who discovered her brother's body after the events of Final Fantasy VIII and was forced to watch as he was taken to Solomon as a wife. She was also the one who was chosen to be Solomon's first queen. She was to become his favorite companion and the mother of his children, but the relationship was far from what she imagined it to be. When Solomon found her in the forest and ordered her to get dressed up as a pretty elf, she refused. She remained in her natural state, and he ordered his servants to beat her. She was only saved by Pug, who came to her rescue. After this, she became a fugitive from Valinor and hid in the forest. She was finally tracked down by Arutha, who had become king after Arutha the Younger's death. She had already been banished from Valinor, so he had no qualm with killing her. After her death, a tragic romance was written into the story between her and the dwarf. In the story, it was only her great affection and friendship for Pug that caused her to defy her brother and marry the dwarf. In reality, she was a Valinor elf who had been abducted by the elves and forced to serve as their queen. The dwarf in the story was Arutha, who became king after his brother's death. But in spite of her past, he still loved her. The manga and anime adaptations do not portray this version of the story. Rather, she is the one who defies her brother and marries the dwarves. Her decision to do so is presented as a happy one. In the manga, she is alive at the end of the story. In the anime, she is alive at the very end. In the games, she is dead after Final Fantasy IX. The games also show that her elf blood is very strong. It can be seen in the fact that she is not affected by the crossbow cannons in the same way as other races. She is immune to the effects of the elemental shells fired by the crossbow cannons, regardless of whether she is hit by one. In the manga and anime, she has a brother whose name is not Arutha. He is known as Durg. Durg is a Valinor elf name. It means dweller in the dew. While he shares many of the same traits as his sister, including having snow-white hair, he is very different. Where she is gentle and kind, he is quick to anger and lash out at those around him. He has a dark and brooding appearance. In appearance he is closer to a dwarf or gnome than an elf. In the games, he shows up in the first game on his sister's elfstones, a set of 6 elfstones which allow the possessor to call on the aid of elves. When the elfstones are placed upon the elfstones of another elf, their magic will combine. His absence from the sequels is noticeable, but for the most part, it's just never been mentioned. In the manga and anime, he is alive at the end of the story. In the games, he is alive at the very end. In the games, he is dead before Final Fantasy IX. After his sister's death, he becomes king. In the Elfstones of Volcar, when you attempt to call on the aid of Durg, the Elfstones are destroyed. Durg is killed by an elf arrow. This is the first death for the Elfstones. In the games, he is the first person you meet when you get off the boat after reaching the Elfstones. In the manga and anime, he is the brother of Tsuyu. In the games, he is the brother of Surani. He is known to have a strong sense of justice. He will not hesitate to kill those who would harm his elf kin. He is also known to have a great affection for Pug, aka White Pug, the friendly dwarf. Despite his race and differences, he has become like a brother to him. In the manga and anime, he has a more tragic past. He was the one who discovered his sister's body after the events of Final Fantasy VIII and was forced to watch as she was taken into Solomon's service. He was also the one who was chosen to be Solomon's first queen. He was to become his favorite companion and the mother of his children, but the relationship was far from what he imagined it to be. When Solomon found him in the forest and ordered his servants to beat him, he refused. He remained in his natural state, and Solomon ordered his servants to beat him. He was only saved by Pug, who came to his rescue. After this, he became a fugitive from Valinor and hid in the forest. He was finally tracked down by Arutha, who had become king after his brother's death. He had no qualm with killing him, as he was an elf. After his death, a tragic romance was written into the story between him and Pug. In the story, it was only his great affection and friendship for Pug that caused him to disobey his king and marry the dwarf. In reality, he was a Valinor elf who had been abducted by the elves and forced to serve as their queen. The dwarf in the story was Arutha, who became king after his brother's death. But in spite of his past, he still loved him. The games portray his death differently. You meet him in the second game, when he dies during the attack on the elves. He is killed by an elf arrow. This is the second death for Durg. In the games, he has a sister whose name is not Arutha. She is known only by her elf name, Elcries, and is the last of her kind. Elcries. The name Elcries is an elven one. It means, one who is the seed of the tree. She is the last of her kind. She is also the only one who can awaken the elf stones. She is very fond of Pug and the dwarf. In the games, she is the first elf you meet when you reach the elf stones. She is the only elf who can wield the elf stones. In the games, she is the wife of Pug. In the story, she is the sister of Durg. After her brother's death, she becomes the king's wife. In the games, she tries to kill you, but you kill her first. In the games, she is an important character. In the story, she is an unimportant character. In the story, she is known as El. In the story, she is known as Railing. Railing. You reach the elf stones and call on the elf stones. But Durg is not there. Where is Durg? You ask. Durg is gone, she answers. He is dead. He was killed by an elf. No. You cry, and you strike the elf with the elf stone. The elf stone turns to sand in her hand. He is gone. The elf stones are broken and cannot save him anymore. You should give them to another elf. One who will live. But he was my friend, you say. He was a mortal with a sword. He had no true friends. He did not know what friendship was. What can be done? You ask, and you begin to weep for him. Your grief turns to anger. You strike the elf with the elf stone, and the sand elf flies away. He will be avenged, she answers. But not by his own doing. It is not his fault. It is not our doing, you answer. He was my brother. I will avenge him. You leave the elf stones in the forest, far from any elf stones. You do not know what to do. You cannot bring yourself to kill a fellow elf. You cannot bring yourself to kill a fellow elf in cold blood. You cannot bring yourself to fight your brother's killer. It is not your battle. It never was. You never believed it to be. You leave the elf stones and go back to your home. You are Durg's brother. You did your best. You are ready to get vengeance for him. The only thing left to decide is who will take his place. You will choose who you think best deserves to become king. The next page is missing. You have made your decision. You return to your home. You are a fugitive from the elves for killing one of their elves. The elven hunters are after you. You will have to kill an elf to prove you are not an elf. You have many ideas.